Welcome to the Population Reference Bureau's webinar launch of the 2011 World Population Data Sheet, The World at 7 Billion. Please visit prb.org, that's www.prb.org, for copies of the data sheet, the associated bulletins, and our interactive map, bringing the World Population Data Sheet to life. Our opening remarks today will be from Wendy Baldwin, the President and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau. Our presenters today will be Carl Haub, the Senior Visiting Scholar and co-author of the data sheet and the summary report, James Gribble, the Vice President of International Programs and co-author of the summary report, and Linda Jacobsen, Vice President of Domestic Programs. There are a few things to note before we begin. There will be no audio interaction during this webinar. Questions can be asked online through the questions section of your GoToWebinar toolbar. We will respond to as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions by typing them into the question section of the toolbar at any point during the webinar. We will not be using the chat functionality of the toolbar. Should you have any technical questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them. They will be answered immediately on your toolbar question function within the GoToWebinar toolbar. We will be collecting your questions during the webinar. Those that are not answered verbally following the presentations may be answered during a future PRB Discuss Online. We encourage you to look for future PRB Discuss Online sessions. Those of you listening to audio via telephone will incur long-distance charges, and we encourage those of you joining us nationally and internationally to listen to the webinar via your computer rather than through the telephone line. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the PRB website after August 1st. We encourage you again to go to prb.org, www.prb.org, for copies of the data sheet and a copy of this webinar. As a suggestion, if you have a mobile telephone, please move it away from your computer or telephone line. It can interfere with your ability to hear the audio of the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, Wendy Baldwin.
Thank you. This is the first year we are holding an electronic event to release the World Population Data Sheet instead of a face-to-face meeting. And while we cannot serve you coffee, we can serve far more people in more parts of the world at the same time. And we are. There are almost 400 people registered for this webinar. The webinar is accessible to people all around the world and in real time, which is fitting since this is about data for the world and it's the most current data. And in fact, a third of our webinar participants are outside the U.S. This represents our continued commitment to reach more and more people with objective and timely population, health, and environment data and analysis. And please check out the additional material on prb.org. There's an interactive world map illustrating key demographic variables by country and region. We'd like you to use it, and this map can be embedded on other websites using simple coding. There's also a 3-minute video called 7 Billion and Counting that I think you'll enjoy. 3 of our senior demographers, Carl Haub, James Gribble, and Linda Jacobsen, will highlight key findings from the data sheet, and they are all ready to answer your questions, so please post them in the question box anytime during the webinar. And finally, you may follow us on Twitter at WendyPRB for news stories and data. Again, thank you for joining this webinar.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carl Haub.
Did you know that we're today, 2011, in the midst of the largest population growth in world history? This may actually run a little bit counter to some articles you read lately in the popular press and popular media. But take a look at this graph. Naturally enough, it took us all of human history to reach that first billion. But that didn't happen until 1800. About 50,000 years worth of very, very slow population growth. We certainly didn't have to wait very long for the second billion. That took only 130 years. But now look at the most recent. Billion 6 and 7 took 12 years each. 7 will arrive this coming October. But look, even the 4th and the 5th billion took 14 and 13 years. And when you consider 50,000 years, I don't think there's much difference between 12, 13, and 14. But today what I think we're really concerned about is billion 8, and when will that come? Will it come in 12 years? Will it take a few years longer? Or even, would it come faster? This, I think, is one of the most important issues that we face today. And this graph is a picture that I think many of us who've been looking at population have seen many times. And the picture in many ways has not really changed very much, except for the fact that the population of the developing countries, which is Africa, Asia, Latin America, parts of Oceania, that projection has been creeping up a little bit. Whether it continues to do that, we don't know, but it certainly has been. But one thing we know for sure, the picture that you're looking at right now is going to happen. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, haven't I read sometimes that population projections are really pretty wrong? Well, yeah, that did happen back in the U.S., baby boom, but hey, that was 40 years ago. We do know that this is going to happen. Okay, how do we know that? In order to get a quick look at that answer, let's look at the population pyramids of the developed and the developing countries, what we might call the rich and the poor countries. And the first pyramid is that for the developed countries, which is essentially Europe, North America, and Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Now, I think if you went to Cairo, took a trip, and went out to Giza to see the pyramids, and you saw this, you'd ask for a refund. This is no pyramid. It doesn't even have a base. It's like Cleopatra's Needle. It's an obelisk. What's going on here? I've been sold a bill of goods. Well, of course, this is what the pyramid of the developed countries looks like because of the very low birth rates throughout Europe and Japan, Australia, and even the U.S., which does not have a high birth rate, although it seems high compared to some European countries. The next pyramid we'll look at is that of the developing countries. Now that's more like it. There is a pyramid. And I want to point out something very important. The scale of these pyramids, which is 300 million across the bottom for both sexes, is exactly the same. So the contrast here is not just in shape, but in size. And I don't think it takes a lot to understand that these poor countries have huge potential for population growth. And what happens with that 8 billion and then the 9th billion beyond it is going to be completely dependent on what happens to the birth rate in those countries. Now, developing countries, I think just about every single one, has at least had a verbal commitment to slow population growth. And starting in the 70s and 80s in a serious way, birth rates came down in many countries. And here's some examples from different parts of the world. Thailand had a very aggressive, and I think is a fair word, an innovative family planning program to bring the message of smaller families to its people. And you can see that the same things have happened in several others, many in fact. But here's the hitch. World population projections assume that everyone is going to do what you're looking at here. All developing countries are going to see their fertility drop to about 2 children. They're going to do it smoothly. There won't be any interruptions, and the train will pull into the station right on time. Now, how realistic really is that? Certainly, sub-Saharan Africa is an area of concern these days. There's no doubt about that. Everyone talks about the still very high birth rates in many African countries and the fact that they really don't seem to be coming down very quickly. And let's remember again that we do assume that they will for our projections to come true. It's not just sub-Saharan Africa. Here we have several countries of North Africa. We have Egypt and Pakistan, Indonesia, and Jordan. Now, if we look at these, we can see that the trend in fertility, and it's going back to the 1980s, is relatively flat. So they don't look like the countries we saw 2 slides ago. Indonesia, for example, boy, I remember in the 1980s, Indonesia got a great deal of publicity about its very innovative family planning program, and they have been around 3 children or less, oh gee, how long? At least 25 years. But they have not come down to 2 children. And of course, the world population total is going to depend on, at least in part, on two of the world's biggest countries, which would be China and India. In China, there is a lot of speculation today about the possibility of its loosening up its one-child family program. We'll see. But India is a different case. In India, fertility remains relatively high in the largest states and the states with the highest level of poverty. Those two on the left, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, together have 300 million people. In other words, virtually the population of the U.S., and they have the highest fertility. So we can, I think, easily see that India's population future is going to depend upon what happens in those states. Now let's turn the page a bit to a different picture. Remember before when we looked at that pyramid, it wasn't a pyramid, and here's why it isn't a pyramid. Look at the decline in birth rates in these developed countries, particularly in Germany, which came down to about 1.5 children per woman 40 years ago. So we won't spend that much more time on this graph, but I might invite you to come back and take a look in detail later because it is pretty interesting. Now we come to something that I think is stark as well as being very sad. We call it the demographic divide. And it shows the vast difference that has developed between the poor and rich countries of the world. Italy and Congo Democratic Republic have about the same population today. But look at the projected population for Congo in 2050, 149 million. Whereas Italy at 62 million, and it's only going to grow because of migration. And let's remember that that projection for Congo assumes that they will have a uninterrupted decline in fertility to 2 children per woman. The number of births in the two countries, and remember they're about the same size, 3 million in Congo and just over 500,000 in Italy. What a difference. And finally, what I think is one of the sadder numbers, the annual number of infant deaths in Congo is about 340,000, and it's 2,100 in Italy. Yeah, I know, the rate is higher in Congo, but numbers count. 111 doesn't mean much to me in some ways, but 340,000 does. Lastly, and another different way of looking at this demographic divide, we see the population pyramid of Germany. A little closer, you might say, look at that obelisk that wasn't a pyramid we saw before. And here we have an upside-down pyramid. Germany has entered what we call the 4th stage of a demographic transition, fertility that is well below 2 children per woman. And my colleague here, James Gribble, is going to take you on a tour through what demographers call the demographic transition.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Gribble will now be presenting.
I'd like to take that figure of 7 billion and look at it by the world region to get a closer look at population change. Let's focus on birth rate, which is the number of births each year per 1,000 people living in a country, and at death rates, which are the number of deaths each year per 1,000 people living in a country. We can think about countries of the world as in transition, from high rates of birth and death to low rates of birth and death. A concept that Carl mentioned, we refer to it as the demographic transition. We can break this transition into 4 phases based on current levels of fertility, and in phase 1, we include countries with many births and many deaths, and for our purposes, we put countries with a total fertility rate of above 5 into this phase. Phase 2 includes countries that are experiencing declines in the number of births and deaths and that have a total fertility rate of between 3.5 and 5. Phase 3 countries are approaching replacement fertility with a total fertility rate of 2 to 3.5. And finally, phase 4 countries have low or very low birth and death rates with a total fertility rate below 2. And within any country, regardless of the phase that it's in, we could also see variability if we looked at data from the state level or the province level or the district level in terms of births and deaths. But when we go back to the national level and when we look at the proportion of the world's population according to these four phases, the results are surprising to me because the great majority, 84%, live in countries with fertility rates that are either at replacement or approaching it. And this is largely due to the low fertility rates in India and China. Looking more closely at birth rates and death rates, we can see the transition in action. On the next few slides, you'll see data on births and deaths, and each diamond represents a country based on its current birth and death rates. The diagonal line represents the point where births are equal to deaths. So if the diamond falls below the line, then there are more births than deaths, and if that diamond is above the line, deaths exceed births. And here we see Africa with high death rates, but even higher birth rates. We see a lot of variation in this figure, reflecting the diversity of Africa's economic well-being, health status, and gender norms. Now, we've included Asia and Oceania, represented by pink circles. And here we have birth and death rates that are lower than Africa, and some of the countries are moving to the point where births and deaths are equal. The blue squares now represent North, Central, and South America, where birth rates are generally lower than in Asia, but births still exceed deaths. And the green triangles represent Europe, where deaths in many places are exceeding births. So we can see that the world is in transition from high birth and death rates down to lower birth and death rates, and then to low birth, and because of the age structure, increasing death rates. Now let's go a little bit further. When we take the difference between birth and death rates, we get what's called the rate of natural increase, and that's if the difference is positive. If the difference is negative, we call it the rate of natural decrease. And here I've selected an African country, Chad, shown in the big diamond in the upper right corner, with a birth rate of 46 and a death rate of 19. The difference between births and deaths is 29, which means that each year there are about 29 people added to Chad's population per 1,000 people already in it. This means that Chad's population will double in about 24 years. In the next few slides, we see the relationship between rates of natural increase and the average number of births that women in a given country have during their lives. And this is the total fertility rate. We'll look at continents and see the variation across the different countries as they spread across the four phases of the demographic transition I mentioned earlier. So let's consider sub-Saharan Africa, which has countries in all four phases of the transition, but most are in either phase 1 or 2. And the black diamond in the upper right corner is Uganda, which in many ways is a typical phase 1 country. With 35 million people, Uganda is growing at more than 3% each year, doubling in about 20 years. Half of the population is aged 15 or younger, and women on average have more than 6 children. Fewer than 1 in 5 married women use effective contraception in Uganda. Among American countries, Guatemala is the only one in phase 2 of the demographic transition, and it's shown here in the black square. Its fertility rate has recently dropped from just over 4 to about 3.5. In contrast to other American countries, it contrasts to other American countries that are already approaching replacement fertility or have already reached it. With 14 million people, Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America and is likely to double in size in about 28 years. 1 in 3 married women use modern contraception, and about 40% of Guatemala's population is indigenous, and they have lower access to health services and to education, but this situation has been improving. Asia also shows a lot of variation in its demographic transition, with many countries in phase 3 or 4. The black circle is India, firmly in phase 3. With 1.2 billion people, India is the second largest country in the world. Its low population growth rate means that it'll take more than 50 years to double in size. Half of India's population is aged 25 or younger, and women have on average between 2 and 3 children. And though it's an emerging economic powerhouse, more than 3 out of every 4 Indians lives on less than $2 a day. And now if we look at Europe, we see most countries are in phase 4, with below replacement fertility. The black triangle here represents Germany, which has a negative growth rate like many European countries. With 82 million people, Germany's population is getting smaller because of very low fertility rates. Half of Germans are aged 44 or younger, which is a stark contrast to Uganda's median population age of 15. At 7 billion, our world is clearly in transition. Fertility is slowing, people are living longer and healthier lives, and opportunities for indigenous people are improving. Across the world, within any country, in any community, populations face challenges. And the ways that people respond to those challenges will shape each country's future development.
Ladies and gentlemen, Linda Jacobsen, Vice President of Domestic Programs.
So we just heard about demographic conditions in Germany, one of the countries in stage 4 of the transition. I'm going to shift our focus now to discuss demographic trends in the United States, one of the other countries in stage 4. The first thing to note about the United States is that its population growth exceeds that in most of Europe, with the exception of Spain. Over the last decade, the population in the U.S. increased by almost 10% compared to only 1.6% for Europe as a whole. You can also see in this graph that a number of European countries actually declined in size over the last 10 years, including Poland, Germany, Russia, Romania, and the Ukraine. But you might ask, how does the pace of population growth in the U.S. compare to the pace of population growth for the world that Carl showed a few minutes ago? Well, the U.S. is still growing rapidly, but the pace is projected to slow down over the coming years. Back in 1790, the U.S. population stood at 3.9 million, and it took 124 more years for it to reach the 100 million mark, which happened back in 1914. However, it took only 54 years for the U.S. to add the next 100 million people, and only 38 years to go from 200 million to 300 million. Current Census Bureau projections suggest that the U.S. population will reach 400 million in 2039, a period of only 33 years. This is only a little less time than it took to add the last 100 million people, so the pace of growth does appear to be slowing down. So how is the U.S. population growing? James discussed the role of natural increase in population growth, but there is another factor that has been important in the U.S., and that is net immigration. This graph shows the percent of population growth in the last 3 decades that has been due to natural increase versus net immigration. While more than 60% of U.S. growth has been due to natural increase, the share due to net immigration has increased from 24% to 36% across this 30-year period. It is this combination of natural increase and net immigration that has sustained the population growth rate in the U.S. and made its profile different from the other developed countries in stage 4 of the transition. In fact, it is not only the level of net immigration, but also the timing of when increases occurred that help to explain population growth in the U.S. This graph compares trends in the average number of births per woman with trends in immigration, reflected by the percent of the population that is foreign-born. What is particularly interesting to note in this graph is that immigration began to rise rapidly in the early 1970s at about the same time that the average number of births leveled off at around 2 children per woman. So the higher levels of immigration to the U.S. helped to offset the declines in fertility and kept the U.S. population growth rate relatively high compared to its European counterparts. One other important aspect of U.S. population growth has been increasing racial and ethnic diversity. In 2010, non-Hispanic whites made up 64% of the total population, but this share is projected to drop below 50% by 2042. In contrast, the Hispanic population has more than doubled since 1990, and Latinos now make up almost 1 in every 6 U.S. residents today. This growing diversity is a result of both increased immigration, especially from Mexico, and different fertility rates among major racial and ethnic groups. This graph shows the relative levels of births, deaths, and net immigration for 4 major racial and ethnic groups in the United States. If we look first at non-Hispanic whites, we see that the number of births each year, about 2.2 million, is just a little higher than the annual number of deaths, about 2 million, meaning that natural increase is fairly small for this group. Some additional population is added through net immigration, about 120,000 people, but this number is much smaller than the numbers of births and deaths. The components of population growth are quite different for Hispanics. Both the annual number of births and net immigrants far exceed the annual number of deaths, which explains why the Hispanic population is growing so rapidly in the U.S. We see a similar pattern among the fast-growing Asian population, although the number of net immigrants actually exceeds the number of births. Among blacks, births still exceed deaths, but net immigration contributes very little to the growth of this population group. As Carl described a few minutes ago, different levels of natural increase and net immigration have important consequences for the age structure of a population, and the U.S. is no exception. As this population pyramid shows, the age profile of the non-Hispanic white population in the United States is very similar to the age profiles for many European countries, including the one for Germany we saw a few minutes ago. Fertility has declined in this group, which is indicated by the shorter bars at the base of the pyramid, and the population is poised to age very rapidly as the large baby boom cohorts reach ages 65 and older in the next 2 decades. The baby boomers are the wide bulbs just above the center of the pyramid. The age profile of the Hispanic population provides quite a contrast to the one for non-Hispanic whites. Their age structure has a more typical pyramid shape with a wide base and a narrow top, indicative of a younger population with relatively high fertility. 30% of the Hispanic population is less than 15 years old, and only 6% is ages 65 and older. The long bars at the base of the pyramid also indicate another important demographic characteristic, momentum for future growth. Even if fertility rates decline in the future among Hispanics, the large numbers of children already in this population guarantee a sizable number of births in the next 15 to 20 years. As Carl discussed a few minutes ago, there is some uncertainty in world population projections, and of course, there is also some uncertainty in the projections of population growth for the U.S. Since the onset of the recession in 2007, both the number of births and the number of immigrants has declined. Whether the U.S. growth rate will continue to be the envy of Europe will depend on whether fertility and net immigration rebound as the U.S. economy recovers.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now begin our Q&A session. Please remember that questions need to be submitted through your dashboard question box. We will not be accepting questions via chat. As the respondees answer to your questions, you may get a slight delay in the audio answer. We will try and pause our answers before we suggest them so that you will be able to hear the answers. Again, these will not be responded to via the chat mechanism, only through the question and answer in your control panel. The first question is, in a world that is arguably approaching climate, food, energy, water, and other environmental catastrophes, shouldn't there be a greater effort to slow the world population growth?
This is Jay Gribble. And there are a number of issues that challenge the world's population, especially the rapid fertility in certain parts of the world. But I think that if we look at what the evidence says, what research bears out. There are a number of factors that really can influence fertility, and that's where we focus a lot of our attention. For example, access to modern, effective contraception so that women and couples can plan their families as they choose. A number of gender issues also influence fertility. Women who are better educated have fewer children. Women who are empowered have fewer children. Ending child marriage so that women can get married, when they're over 18 or when they're ready to get married. All of these are factors that the evidence demonstrates influence fertility behaviors by driving fertility down. And this is evidence that we think is really important to focus our attention on.
For those of you who have just joined us, we are in the question and answer session of our Population Reference Bureau's webinar. The next question is, how are you able to have a real-time counting to add 7 billion individuals? Do you use aggregated data of each country? Because DRC, my country for example, does not have an updated file on its population.
Yeah, this is Carl Haub. Well, you certainly hit the nail on the head for the challenges of putting together data for some 240 countries of the world. Specifically, yes, aggregated data, that's at the country total. But, just about every country now has a fairly recent census. And it isn't too difficult to project ahead, particularly some countries like the DRC have had demographic and health surveys, so we have a pretty good handle on the birth rate. And that can tell us an awful lot about where a country's population size stands right now. And that's pretty much the, pretty much what we do for most countries, especially developing ones. So hope that answers your question satisfactorily.
Again, we're in the question and answer session for the Population Reference Bureau's webinar. The next question is, the world's population growth rate is very highly mainly developing countries. Are you taking any steps to control the high growth rate and to make people aware about the bad effect of the population explosion in developing countries?
This is Jay Gribble again. And I think the mission of the Population Reference Bureau is to use data and scientific evidence to craft messages and reach policymakers, advocates, the media about population and health issues. I think that there's a lot of evidence about population growth and factors that drive rapid population growth. Some of those I mentioned just a minute ago. But I think that our position as an organization is that rather than taking a position, we really try to look at what does the evidence say and try to reach out to policy audiences so that they can make the best decisions for their countries, working with advocates and, again, working with media to raise accountability for government leaders in the given country. So, again, our stance is not to advocate, but to focus on the evidence.
Thank you, Jay. We are in the question and answer session for the Population Reference Bureau's webinar. The next question is, what surprised you most in preparing the data sheet in comparison with the 2010 data?
This is Carl again. I think it's actually Jay and I, we saw this question on the way over here, so we were kind of talking about it, and there's not too many surprises in demography, but there are certainly very many interesting observations. But I think a couple of surprises in Africa in particular, whereas say in Burundi and Zimbabwe, the birth rate came out higher than we had thought. So I thought that was another indication yet of what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa. Another development, too, which was not a shock, but, still, I mean, you have to wait and measure it, is that the recovery of birth rates in many developed countries definitely came to an end last year. In some it had happened the year before, and everyone, credits this to the recession. And I think that's probably pretty valid because, as Columbo once said, there's no such thing as coincidence. But what did you have to say?
Well, this is Jay, and the pie chart that I presented in my presentation was the big surprise to me because Carl presented the slide about most of the world's population growth taking place in developing countries and how that will project over time. I was really surprised when we took the country populations and put them into the 4 phases, and that almost half of the world's population lives in countries at very low, near replacement fertility levels. 84% are in the phase 3 and phase 4, which is between 3.5 and below replacement fertility levels. So, we think that so many countries have such high levels of fertility, and to me the surprise was that the very high levels of fertility really don't represent total population of the world that much. Again, so much of this is driven by India and China that represent, 2.5 billion people, but still, those numbers have to be taken into account when we think about the world as a complete population.
Yeah, and Jay, you pointed out the percentage of countries of the world that have fairly low birth rates today. Let's think what would have happened if their birth rates had not come down. In fact, remember if we did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation and saying, hey, listen, if the growth rate of world population stayed where it was in the late 60s, about 2.1%, we wouldn't be looking at 7 billion this October. That would have been about 15 or 20 years ago. We'd probably be pushing up around 8.7 to 9 billion today. So that's the difference, that made.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about, the importance of things like family planning in shaping fertility and driving that down can't be underestimated. I mean, a lot of it has been development and education, but family planning is critical to this change.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the Population Reference Bureau's webinar question and answer session. I have a question from Ethiopia that I'm going to paraphrase. The question states that most of the time media and other government organizations within Ethiopia are declaring that there are approximately 80 million in population. There are others in research and in academia that state that there are approximately 90 million. The questioner makes a statement saying that 10 million can make a big difference and that an organization like the Population Reference Bureau can influence this discrepancy, and have you done so?
Well, you really struck to the core of PRB's mission, which is to provide the best numbers that we possibly can, and distribute those around the world. In many countries, we cannot be absolutely certain of what the population size is, but certainly for Ethiopia, a major country of Africa, we have certainly striven to do that. So I hope that you find the results of what we've done satisfactory and acceptable to you. And thanks for the question.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the question and answer session for the Population Reference Bureau's webinar. We have approximately 15 minutes left in this webinar session, and we have just a few more questions here that I'll ask to our panelists. What are the best arguments for explaining that just because some countries are experiencing an aging population, that family planning is still important? Maternal health is an obvious reason, but what about demographic reasons?
Well, the birth rate. Pretty simple answer. If you have a low birth rate, you have an aging population, and a lot of people say above the age of 65. In Japan, it's, I believe, 23% of the population is above the age of 65, partly because they have long life expectancy, but also because they have a low birth rate and have had it for some years. So that's what it really comes down to. It's a pretty straightforward answer.
The next question is, how reliable are the numbers coming out of China now, and what might be the change in current policy in overall growth of the country?
Well, China takes very good censuses, and there's always some question about missing people in all censuses, but basically China's census is accepted. There are a lot of rumors now, and I think maybe there are more than rumors about the possibility of China beginning to become concerned about its aging as it looks across the world to Europe and sees what happens when birth rates get low. So there's an awful lot of discussion about this possibility that China might relax its one-child policy. That will probably have an effect on the birth rate, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to have an enormous baby boom. But still, as some people have said, if China gets the sniffles, the world catches a demographic cold. So it could definitely make a difference in how long it takes to get to that 8 billion that we were looking at before.
Okay, we're going to take a question pertaining to the United States. And we have approximately 14 minutes left in this webinar. Based on the levels of immigration exemplified in the United States, are we undershooting the population growth rates of developing countries that are experiencing conflict and other triggers of immigration?
Can you repeat that question?
Certainly. Based on the levels of immigration exemplified in the United States, are we undershooting the population growth rates of developing countries that are experiencing conflict and other triggers of immigration? I think what the questioner is trying to state is, with the amount of global conflict going on in the world, is the United States underestimating the amount of immigration that may take place?
I don't think the Census Bureau is underestimating the levels of net immigration. They have, in fact, in their most recent projections, reduced the levels of net immigration that they're expecting. You have to remember that net immigration is controlled in the U.S. by a number of policies. We don't have open borders. So regardless of levels of conflict in other places in the world, it would be changes in policy that would greatly impact the levels of net immigration.
Thank you for that. You are currently in the question and answer session of the Population Reference Bureau's webinar. We have approximately 10 minutes left in the webinar, and the next question is, do you think that the U.S. Hispanic population will experience a decrease in birth rates as they integrate into American society?
This is Linda Jacobsen again. The evidence does suggest, in fact, that Hispanic fertility rates do decline with succeeding generations. So in other words, the children of Hispanic immigrants tend to have lower fertility than the Hispanic immigrant parents who are in the generation before. It's also interesting to note, however, that levels of fertility among Hispanics in the U.S. are actually higher than the levels of fertility among Hispanics back in Mexico, for example. So that also suggests that Hispanic fertility will come down. But I want to stress that if you remember that last population pyramid that we looked at, the momentum for future growth in the Hispanic population is already present because of those long bars at the base of the pyramid. There are lots of numbers of Hispanic children already in the United States. So even if they have fewer children per woman than their mothers had, the momentum for growth is still there. And that, of course, is basically what happened during the baby boom in the U.S.
Thank you for that. We have another fertility question. This is about global fertility. And it's, while global fertility continues to decline, how many countries today have rising fertility? Global rising fertility. The question is about global rising fertility. How many countries have global rising fertility?
Oh, well, let's see. Not many, certainly. Russia had a big increase in the birth rate. I say big. They went from about 1.2 to about 1.5 or 6 children due to some fairly large incentives to have more children that were instituted by the government. And there have been some European countries up until recently who have had small increases in fertility. I can't think offhand of a developing country where it rose. No, wait, yes, I can. Yes, well, Zimbabwe we mentioned before, and it does appear to be a rise, but also in some of the Central Asian countries, like called the stands, there has been some increase in fertility in those former Soviet republics of Central Asia. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself.
Okay, the next question is, what are some of the key social and economic differences between countries in Africa that have experienced fertility decline and those that haven't, besides the obvious differences in levels of contraceptive use? And I believe Jay's addressed this before, but we'll give the answer one more time.
I will gladly answer this question again because I think the issues are so important. And I think a lot of it boils down to gender equity, women's empowerment. When women are empowered, when they're better educated, when we eliminate practices like child marriage, women are better able to decide the number and timing of children. And they're better able to negotiate with their partners about the number and timing of children. So family planning can't be understated as a critical factor, but it's not the only one. And so, yeah, keep investing in schooling and empowering women, and we'll continue to see changes in high-level fertility in some of these African countries.
We have one last question that we'd like to ask. We have approximately 5 minutes left on this webinar, and the last question for the Population Reference Bureau's webinar launch will be, are U.S. sex education programs resulting in a reduction in teenage fertility, or is this continuing to rise?
Well, I can't speak to the impact of sex education programs because I don't have any research or evidence that would allow me to make a direct link. But what I can say is that the most recent data in the last 2 years from the National Center for Health Statistics has indicated that teenage birth rates have declined in each of the last 2 years. So while I can't attribute it to a direct link, it is good news, in fact, that the teenage fertility rates have been coming down in the U.S.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our question and answer session and concludes the Population Reference Bureau's webinar launch of the 2011 World Population Data Sheet. We appreciate you joining us today and very much appreciate your time. We encourage you to visit www.prb.org for copies of the data sheet, as we said in the beginning, and the associated bulletins, as well as that interactive map showing the world population data, bringing it to life. We now have closing remarks from Wendy Baldwin, the President and CEO. She will be ending our webinar today. Thank you again for your attendance.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone who has dialed into this webinar, and especially our 3 presenters from the Population Reference Bureau. PRB is committed to making data widely available, accessible to the broadest of audiences. And the many questions that you sent in are a sign of the interest that you have in this kind of data, and we are pleased to be able to continue to provide that. Please go to prb.org and see the interactive map, to see the video, and to see the other documents associated with this World Data Sheet. Thank you.